We are going to kick off now really our final two sessions, which take us into the natural world and then back into the built environment. But before we do that, we have another important acknowledgement from Steve Clark, who would like to, as a sponsor, also offer a welcome.
Thank you, Mara. So firstly, just like to acknowledge the Consul General and all of the collected wisdom that is in this room here. Thank you for coming together for a fantastic opportunity. One of the comments earlier was paraphrasing the extent that if we can't envisage what we want things to look like in 2036, that's the only way we're going to get there. That if we can't envisage it, well, we certainly won't get there. We'll get somewhere else. So, yeah, I was a kid in 1974. I don't remember much of the flood event. I remember being piled in the back of the family Mazda, and we lived in regional Queensland at the time, and coming down and helping my uncle get his house back together. It had been completely submerged. It was in Graceville, and it was one of the houses that was bought back by Brisbane City Council after the flood event. So that's my first recollection of flooding. Grew up in a floodplain city or town in rural Queensland, and sort of that's pretty much defined my career ever since. Water technology, we're water, coastal and environmental consultants. We have we do a large body of work in this flooding space, flood risk management, flood warning. We deal a lot with the technical interface, but we also deal a lot with the community interface. So one of the things I'm really interested in, Michael, was it the one of 5,000 scenarios that you guys were looking at? And Roger, the Brisbane River flood study, one of, or is 30,000 scenarios, 50,000 scenarios? However many scenarios are being considered here? That's a massive amount of data. It's a massive amount of knowledge that can feed into our responses to these events, both for the emergency managers, but also for the community. But there are barriers to have that information firstly understandable in real time and understandable to individual community members. So one of the things that is currently developing, and we're really interested in it, is that provision of that technical information out to the community, to individuals, to emergency managers, so that they can make timely decisions as well as on their own, as well as relying on the information that's coming through more regular channels. So part of that is involved in a partnership with some of our Dutch colleagues from the community of practice. Just Leanne, if you could wave your hand. This is Leanne Reichart of Hydrologic, who is also involved in this space, and we have an ongoing collaboration with that. So I can't commend enough to you the value of these sorts of sessions. Thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to be involved in the sponsorship of it. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. I love the fact that the Dutch want to make money, and if we were not mugs, so would we Australians. This is intellectual property of the future. Great to see small businesses taking a lead and making these things happen. Okay, we now begin to reflect on a healthy environment and what that actually means. So, Dr. Jim Smart, we are in your capable hands.
Let's see if we're working. Hello, everybody. I feel a bit like the magician, where somebody stands up in the audience and the coin appears from behind their ear, because what I'm going to talk about is just exactly the sort of stuff that the two speakers before the break made in their general point. So it wasn't a fix, honestly. I hadn't spoken to these people beforehand. Okay, so here we are. Healthy environment. Brisbane River, the catchments in southeast Queensland. Catchments deliver value. Catchments deliver a lot of value to us, and they do so through a whole range of different mechanisms. Some of them come directly from the river corridor itself, the river corridor on the land just directly beside it. That's where the water supply comes from. That's what processes our waste that we dump into it. At least the receiving waters do. Receiving waters for the upper catchment would be Lake Wivenhoe. The main receiving water for the rest of it is Morton Bay, and that's where the waste goes. We do a lot of recreation, a lot of tourism in and around those catchments and receiving waters. And there's a whole stack of useful biodiversity out there, like the dugong, like the seagrass beds. The rest of the catchment, the land surface, also delivers a lot of value, but in a different way. It delivers value through residential housing, industry, farming, and a bit of recreation and tourism, and some biodiversity as well. So we have all of these things that we rely on that catchment for, and we rely particularly heavily on that river corridor for. The jargon for it is to say these are ecosystem services. They deliver us value. We don't always pay for it all directly. We don't necessarily pay to go for a walk on the beach, but we get some value back from it. We get a lot of value from the drinking water. We get a lot of value from the waste assimilation. We get a lot of value from the recreation and tourism. So these ecosystem services deliver value. But when the flood comes, that value delivery drops down. Some of it drops during the event itself. We lose value during the event. But this is different to most of the scenarios the other speakers have been talking about, because those ecosystem services are impacted after the event as well, for years afterwards, maybe for decades afterwards, because of the condition that the catchments are in. How come? How come we lose value, not just in the event, but all the way forward through the next decade or maybe more? Well, there are some direct costs for sure, some direct costs. There's a lot of agricultural land washed out through the big event itself. That's releasing a whole stack of sediment, and therein lies a lot of the problem. This big flood will mobilize a lot of sediments. A whole stack of it will flush out into Morton Bay, but a whole lot of it is held in the catchment system. Doesn't all flush out, but it's sitting there waiting, not necessarily for the next really big flood, but for the next somewhat bigger than normal flow. So once you've released the genie from the bottle, it's in the system there, and it's going to cause you problems. It's going to incur costs. It's going to cost more to treat your water. The amount of chemicals you've got to put in to treat the water is going to go up. You're not sure what else is in there alongside the sediment, so you're going to have to do a bit more disinfection than you would normally do. That carries its own problems. A lot of that sediment ends up in your drainage. I'm sure there are people sitting here who deal with those drainage infrastructure. That's an ongoing cost. That cost doesn't go away just when the big flood goes. It's filling up all the way through, isn't it? Yeah? The port, they're dredging like crazy all the way through. For years to come. It's not just sediment. Sediment carries with it quite a lot of nutrient as well, typically. Those nutrients end up in the receiving waters. We're getting close to the point where we've got a lot of potential problems with bacterial blooms, cyanobacterial blooms. Higher risk of that. They'll shut down your tourism for a while. There's another big loss sitting waiting to happen. The sediment will coat those seagrass beds. Bye-bye to the dugong. Bye-bye to the commercial fisheries. Bye-bye to the recreational fisheries. Lots and lots of loss of value there if we let these ecosystem services suffer. And they are suffering. They are very definitely suffering for years to come. And this is the point that the previous people were making. They're suffering because those catchments are no longer resilient in a natural sense. They used to be. They definitely used to be, but they no longer are. This little map, it shows the amount of and location of the sediment in Morton Bay in 1999 and then after the 2011 flood. There's a whole lot more of it, and it's filled in all the big sinks and holes. So the next big flood that comes down, there's less capacity in there to hold it. It's going to spread wider and further. Bye-bye dugong when those seagrass beds get covered. We work this out, or my scientific colleagues do at least, by taking these cores down into the mud and figuring out how long is it taking for the sediment to build up. Something rather dramatic's happened. over the last 2,500 years, about 2.5 meters, that's about here, isn't it? About 2.5 meters of sediment accumulated in 2,500 years. In the last 160 years, we got about another 60 centimeters. What's that? Somewhere about here? Yeah? That's because we haven't got resilient catchments. We've let the genie out of the bottle. We can see it happening. We know where it's ending up. We know how much of it there is. We know where it's coming from. We know where it's coming from because of radionuclide dating. In the 1950s, when they were detonating atomic devices in the atmosphere, some of those radioactive particles ended up in the surface layers of the soil, and you can trace them. But the sediment that's out in the bay doesn't contain very many of them. It's not coming off the surface, it's coming off at greater depth. The banks are collapsing. We haven't got a stable catchment anymore. We haven't got a resilient system. We can figure out by flying laser-based radar, that's what I think of LiDAR, I'm not a scientist, that's kind of what I think of it as. It'll tell us how much height we've lost or gained after the floods. So you can figure out not only where it's coming from in a general sense, but where it's coming from in a very specific sense, and how much of it is coming out. More than 4 million cubic meters of sediment came out of the upper Brisbane catchment in the 2011 flood. That doesn't make much sense to me, I'm an economist, but I understand that it's about 1,700 Olympic swimming pools worth just out of the upper Brisbane. It's a lot of sediment. You look further down the catchment, it's not just an upper Brisbane problem, it's a whole Brisbane problem. This is the mid-Brisbane. See those little dots up there? Those are people. See the size of the bank here? We know what's going to happen when the next big flood comes. And we know how unstable this is going to be, even for somewhat smaller floods coming down. Again, unless you're out in the catchments, you don't actually see the scale of this. That's the problem. Yeah, we're not resilient anymore. We're not valuing, or we have not historically valued the services that the catchments are delivering to us. We've prioritized doing different things with the landscape. And you know, that's a decision, but we've taken it too far. We've taken that decision too far. We had the description of where the flood was coming from this time. A lot of it in this scenario came out the Lockyer and the Bremer. The Lockyer is known to be a big source of sediment. You can't really see so well here, but there's a bit of blue water up the top there. That's the mid-Brisbane before the Lockyer dumps into it. And that's what the Lockyer does to it in this particular setting. It's not the Lockyer's fault particularly. All of the stream system in southeast Queensland is in a pretty poor condition. Or at least over 50% of it is. Look at it, we can see it. So we know what the problems are. If we carry on like that, things are going to get worse. They ain't going to get better. We've broken the system. So we need to fix it up. It didn't used to be like that. That's near Gatton, back in round about the turn of the century, maybe late 1880s. Look at the trees. Look at the tree cover. That's the mid-Brisbane, or lower Brisbane, actually, I think, 1884. Look at the trees. Different catchment, completely different catchment. We're not talking about fixing up all the land surface. We're talking about the river corridor. It's a different thing. So if we can fix up the river corridor, and we can fix up the river corridor, we'd see a reduction in the amount of sediment that's mobilized. Floods are always going to come. They're always going to remove sediment, but with more heavy vegetation in there, with appropriate management, there won't be nearly as much of it flushing through the system. There won't be nearly as much cost imposed on all of those different cost sources, ecosystem services. It won't cost as much to treat the water. We'll have more headroom to assimilate the waste. We'll still have the dugong, perhaps. So, we know how to do it. It's not a big, we know what the problem is. We know how to do it. We know that we can revegetate catchments. There's plenty of experience in the room here to target exactly where to do it, how to do it, what to do. regrading the steep banks, putting in pile fields. They're like vertical logs that hold back the flow a bit, hold back some sediment, or all of those things in combination in the right sort of places. We even know kind of roughly what it might cost. One of Jim Binney's reports told us that if we want to cut sediment loss by about 150,000 tonnes a year, cost us about 20 million a year to do that. That's not a large amount of money. That's about 250 million present value over about a 20-year period. So we know what to do. We know how to do it. We know where to do it. The question is, can we come up with a mechanism to pay for it? Compare that sort of a number there with what we pay for example, the Goodna Freeway extension. It's a whole different scale. Yeah? What we need is a good appreciation of the value that these catchments are delivering through these ecosystem services for us. Then, collectively, us, because it's we benefit, we're society here, we need to stump up the cash to make those changes happen. We know how to do it, we know what to do, we know where to do it. We just got to figure out, are we prepared to pay for it? And we should be, because it's a really good value investment. So, just closing here, would this be the message from the population in 2036 to us now? Are they going to say to us, thank you for starting to fix up these catchments, doing catchment rehab, getting the resilience in the natural system back, and starting now in 2016? Because it takes a while to get this stuff working, it takes a while for trees to grow. We can't wait till 2035 and press a panic button. We've got to be doing it now. Thank you.
Soon our bankers will become tree huggers. Anne, might I ask you, how is it that between now and 2036, catchment restoration, urban green, support for our environmental infrastructure becomes a widespread community initiative, business initiative, infrastructure initiative? What does it take for that to happen?
How do you turn this on? Is it on? No. What a question. Thank you for the question. I'm expected to come up with an answer. Yes, I was just sitting here thinking, every classroom I've ever been in, I've used the expression, everything that happens in a catchment affects the downstream. And how much have we done in those, I don't know how many years I've been around. How do we get, we've talked a lot about community today, and community, of course, is the nub of it. Because if we're going to persuade them to spend that money on riparian rehabilitation, they've got to be hooked into the story and taught that that money will make a difference. So back to community again. After 2011, we in Oxley Creek catchment were just so horrified that in a small area of 500 hectares between the Brisbane River and the Ipswich motorway, I don't know whether you can visualise it, it includes the Brisbane Golf Club, it includes the Oxley Creek Common, it includes the playing fields of Gregory Terrace and St Aidan's. I'm talking about all those planted areas. Those planted areas, areas with trees, there were over 3 million items distributed. What were they of? They were of huge drums, containers of, lots of squashed aluminium. There was rubbish galore. Of those 3 million items, 2,039 were highly, highly hazardous. So what did the state government have to do? They had to spend millions bringing in a specialist team to pick up all that rubbish. Now, I'm just talking about one lot of 550 hectares. Imagine that all around the city. Why did that happen? Because somewhere in the community, someone's been very lazy and packed their rubbish or not packed their rubbish where it'll be picked up. And that is going on everywhere. Under people's houses, you think of Rockley, Tennyson, Yurongpilly. A lot of material was picked up there. And where's Don from Transport? Don? All those wretched boat pontoons. What happens to them in a flood? They all go downstream. Fancy that. Aren't we bright enough to be, if people have enough money to buy a boat, why on earth can't some licence sort of make them have some structure that stays in place or can be hydraulically dropped to the bottom and chained? I don't know. But once upon a time, the port used to licence those, but I don't know who licenses them now. Do you, Don? Is it Transport? Anyhow, please solve it for me. I can't bear to see all that rubbish. Queensland Pontoon Foundation. Anyhow, sorry. I'm supposed to be solving problems, and I'm just asking questions. But it is all about community. And I know after the floods in 2011, we tried to work in neighbourhoods because, you know, all around Rockley, Ipswich Motorway, it was just devastating. Some of the bigger guys came on board with us, and we asked people into meetings in neighbourhood circles, hoping that in the next flood, they'd all help each other. Unfortunately, you know, you get one group going. We had quite a few successful meetings. We taught all the people who didn't know how to toggle the flood gauges so that they could get information, because another problem in the community with floods is you get cut off. So everybody needs a flood plan, and that was our aim of those workshops, that these businesses, so I'm talking about Ipswich Motorway and all those little streets around Rockley and Cooper's Plains and Acacia Ridge, they need a floodplain so that they know how to get out, so that they know how their employees are safe. So once again, that comes back to community. And I suppose there are many ways to attract community, but I can't give you the answer, but I hope I've given you some description of the things that we're trying to do is, of course, working with business, working with everyone in every school that we can, and every community group that we can to make them more flood aware, more resilient. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Anne. No, we and we value the contribution of people like you. You know, you will be a secret recipe for how we succeed in this. I do believe we have a gentleman from SEQ Catchments with us in the back row, and if someone can share a mic with him, just a little 1-2 minute snippet, you know, you guys have been at this now for quite some time. What is it that we do in the next 20 years differently that gets us to a better place?
Thanks, Mara. I guess talking about Jim's 20 million a year, we've been able to attract so far about $3 million in the last few years to do exactly what he's talking about, put in pile fields, revegetate and so on. We've been chasing funding, I guess, both with others and in using innovative ways for a number of years. And the result of what we're learning is you have to make it normal part of business. So at the moment we're working with a large entity right at the mouth of the river. We've talked about it a few times, the port. They're trying to do their best to find other ways to meet some conditions they have for their licensing. In this case, water sensitive urban desired structures. So they've given us a sizable chunk of money to play with up in that lockyer that Jim's talking about to stabilise that. So there's one example. But what's in it for them is very clearly initially some licence conditions that get met more cheaply than if they were to build wooded structures in certain areas. The other thing they get is potential for starting to stop the sediment coming down to cause them other problems. We're working again with another entity called QUU, who are one of the sponsors, and they're giving us some money again to meet some licensing conditions. So there's two examples. Only in that case it's about nitrogen entering a system and loads and a sewage treatment plant licence. But in the way in which we're running, we're getting stream banks revegetated. What we need is a lot more of that innovative work and a lot more innovative government policy work. And that, I guess, is where our friends in Department of Environment and Heritage Protection have started. But we have to do a lot more. The issue then becomes we're doing it on people's land. And it's very hard to understand when you're down here at the mouth that in that lockyer it's our most productive horticultural country. So if you're asking them to batter back a bank or to give up 10 metres of riparian area for veg or other things, you're costing them a lot of money. So part of what we have to establish in that policy whack is a way of compensating them for that loss of productive capacity, because it's very hard for them to be green, if you like, when they're in the red, as the old saying. So there's some of the things I think we've got to get on to.
No, that's great. And I think the valuation question is key. Once there's a price tag on it, then suddenly, revenue streams can shift. Dorian from LJQ, I heard you kind of whip your hand up. Was that at me? Oh, good. Please make it brief. I'm sure there's other comments from the panel and a few others in the...
No, I just wanted to share a good news story in that and SEQ catchments are a partner in this. They've actually formed a Resilient Rivers program, and there is a strategy to actually achieve some of the outcomes that were discussed in here, to make some reductions. And some of the statistics that I just quickly Googled online there is $2 million investment by Queensland Government, Healthy Catchments funding of $2.4 million through regional NRM investment, 50,000 hectares are covered under land for wildlife in the catchment, 7,000 hectares of hill slope and gully erosion management is underway, and 887 kilometres of stream bank flood resilience works are happening.
Look, that's a sensational example, currently run under the Council of Mayors, an example of what Stanford University calls collective impact, critical vehicle for bringing forward multiple investors towards shared aims. Very good. Mike.
Just picking up on the Resilient Rivers initiative, it's we've kind of described as a sleeping dwarf over the last couple of years, but I think it's emerging potentially as one of the game changers in our part of the world into the future. And I say that because there's political will behind it. The Lord Mayor is chairing the Resilient Rivers Task Force, so he's absolutely put his mouth and he's putting some cash where that is. So I suspect that's going to get some momentum into the future. SEQ Water's involved in it. For those who don't know, Mount Crosby Water Treatment Plant, our largest in the region, supplies about 40% of the region's water supply. So when we get the dirty sluggers coming down via the Lockyer into the mid-Brisbane, it causes all sorts of problems. I think the challenge for us, and we talked a little bit about it already, how do we sell that to the broader community? And there's a lovely little phrase, and I don't think it's stretching it too far to say, the Lockyer in the mid-Brisbane are as important to southeast Queensland as the Great Barrier Reef is to North Queensland. It sustains incredibly fertile farming land, sustains our water supply critically, and then you start to get into Morton Bay from tourism, fishing, and that's without bringing in the Port of Brisbane and the cost that they've been incurring, particularly over 2011 and 2013. We talked about the funding challenges and where we could possibly go. We can all now talk about climate change and potentially talk about carbon again and carbon offsets, which is a lovely thing. At SEQ Water, we were looking and have been looking at that notion of what about the smart carbon credit, where you get a carbon bounce and a carbon offset, and you get a water quality offset. And why can't we have something like that mums and dads, if they want to, they can invest in? So I think we've got to think a bit of left field, but most importantly, and we keep going back to it, how we engage the community.
Okay, great. We have one more question in about 1 minute. So please.
Okay, I just wanted to add quick, I'm from the Queensland Farmers Federation, so I just wanted to talk about that upper catchment. Some of the biggest landholders in that area are farmers. So in adding on to a couple of points, so the 20 million that would be brilliant to get invested into the catchment for 1 year would be fantastic, but if you take it into perspective, the Australian government's going to invest 56 million in the whole GBR catchment over the next 3 years for the same thing. Upper catchment works on erosion, nutrient control. But one of the benefits that does happen is when you're investing with landholders and land users in that sense, you get buyback. So within the Great Barrier Reef catchment over the last few years, every dollar invested, I think, has made about $1.50 invested from the actual landholders. So there is a really good uptake in the ability from a landholder's perspective to do those things like riparian zones and controlled trafficking, all those things that kind of make sense for them economically, but also for the wider catchment. So with so much of the upper catchment being farmed, it's really important to look after those people and make sure they're educated enough to make those smart decisions that benefit everybody downstream as well.
Thank you so much for reminding us of the importance of the farming community on this journey. Our cities rely on them. Okay, fantastic. Can I say a big thank you to Jim? Where is he? He's disappeared into the ether. That was a fantastic interlude.